Hey guys, welcome to the second part of the StarCruiser tutorial. Right now we're going to be putting in some drums. Finding the perfect kick really depends on the song. So at this point, it's really just a matter of looking through what drums you have and seeing which one sounds the closest to what you're looking for. Sometimes though, you're not going to get the perfect kick or the perfect snare or the perfect clap. And at that point, you have to look at layering, which is just basically stacking one sample over the other and then meshing it together to create something really nice. Now that I have an acceptable kick, now it's time to find a good snare and clap. So the snare and clap that I found are pretty good, but the clap has a little bit of sound going right before the transient, so instead of using the regular sequencer, I've just put the sound right onto the playlist. A lot of producers always put their drums directly onto the playlist. Me, I prefer to use a sequencer, but there's always exceptions. So now that I have the claps laid out, I'm going to do a little change to the kicks. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a layer. And what this layer is going to allow me to do is play these two kick samples at the same time. Now, it's not really necessary, but it's just to make things a bit more simple. So now I'm putting some of the drums onto the mixer channel, and since I kind of have an idea of what sound I'm going for, I'm going to be trying to adjust it little by little to what I want it to be. Now, for the clap, I like to remove the lower ends. That way it gives the kick some room to stand out. But you know, depending on the sound, it's always a balancing act. What I really wanted to do here was I kind of wanted to lower the volume of the snare clap layer, but I didn't want it to just turn the whole thing down. So what I wanted to do was just to do some EQing and then hoping that it would level out with the kick, which it did. Next thing I want to do is add a compressor, which will blend all the kicks together and then give it a nice heavy sound. Now you could use a regular compressor. I like to use a multi-band compressor. It gives me the opportunity to compress each part of the spectrum a bit differently, which in my opinion creates a pretty nice sound. But of course, that always depends on the drum. Sometimes all I've needed was just a regular compressor, or even using Fruity Limiter, I can do a little bit of compression. Sometimes I don't even use a compressor at all. You know, just with EQing the different drums, it could sound perfect just the way it is. Truth is though, you have to be very careful with compression, because that can make or break the song. Generally speaking though, if you're making any type of music that has a bit more emphasis on the drums, then you're going to have to do some drum processing one way or another. So here's something that I don't like about the kick so far. There are two transients, which doesn't really sound that good. So what I mean by two transients is that there's the first transient, then there's a little bit of dip, and then the second transient comes in. And in this case, it's because of the sub in the kick. It actually comes in a little bit later after. So we're gonna have to go back to the compressor and fix that. I maxed out the attack, which is essentially the time it takes for the compressor to come in, which means I can lower the threshold to get a bit more of a consistent sound, and then just bump up the gain. And now, while you still see the dip, the kick has a nice shape to it, meaning that the sub no longer sticks out like a sore thumb. Now I just lower the decay, and now I get a really tight kick. So as you can tell, our drums are starting to sound pretty good. But I almost forgot to put in the darling snare. So I mean the drums sound just fine the way it is, but let's try and integrate this to add an extra layer. So I have to take into consideration that I don't want this snare to conflict with the other clap. I want it to add together to make something nice. So while in the first snare and clap, I had a bit more emphasis to the higher end, this one's going to have a little bit more emphasis to the lower end. So they should blend together quite nicely without conflicting. And now that I have both playing at the same time, I can, approach the sound that I want. So now that I'm playing all the drums, you can start to see that everything is starting to come together. At this point, it's just doing a little bit of tweaks here and there, but I kind of want to adjust the snare a little bit more, so I'm going to use a Fruity limiter plugin on it. So for the snare, what I did is similar to that of the kick, which is I lower the threshold, then I add some attack, and then I bump up the gain. And that'll give us a nice shape for the snare. So now I bump up the volume of my kick, do a little bit more balancing, and now I've run a filter through the master. That way I can just sort of look for any problems with the current drum mix. And so far, everything looks pretty good. I won't put in the hi-hats just yet. I want to mix this with the sample. But ensuring a nice drum mix really does require a bit of time to sort of listen and point out the potential errors or things that you don't like. So that in itself takes a little bit of time. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to send all the drums into one mixer channel, and that way I can start to balance and mix the drums as its own thing. I like to do this because it gives me the opportunity to EQ and compress the drums as a whole, and it helps me get a nice consistent sound when it comes to the drums. Although the downside is that a little bit along the line while I'm making the song, if I want to adjust the volume of certain things on its individual mix, so let's say just like the kick or just the snare, sometimes I have to actually go back to the mixer channel, to the send channel, and do a bit more adjustments. So it helps with making a consistent sound, but it also adds an extra step when it comes to debugging. So now what I'm doing is I'm decreasing the velocity of the second and fourth kick, because what that'll do is that'll add a bit more room for the snare to come in and stand out a little bit more. And because I lower the velocity of that, it helps give a consistent peak volume for the drum and the kick. Because sometimes, you could have them both at the same volume, or maybe the kick is a bit louder than the snare. But when you look at the master volume, the peak for when the snare kicks in is a lot higher than the kick. So this is just a way to balance it. That and a bit more EQing. Some people just throw in a limiter and call it a day, but you really shouldn't do that till the very, very end. Again, compressors and limiters are really powerful tools, but if you don't know how to use them correctly, then they could really mess up the track. So the next thing I want to do is introduce the sidechain compression. Personally, I like to use Fruity limiter for the compression because it gives me an idea visually on what is going on with the sample. Since I already have the kick processed, it doesn't really take much to really see the song get going once you throw in the sidechain. I just don't want to reduce the threshold too much, otherwise you're going to really notice the ducking. You never want to overdo your sidechaining. Typically, the sidechaining is just so you can replace the drums that are on the sample with your drums. Now, what I'm doing right now is I'm adjusting the sample on the playlist because I have a problem so far with this track. Sometimes the transient are actually coming in before the sidechain compression. Usually, you should look out for those when you're making the song. So as you're chopping, you see things here and there, but sometimes we miss it, so you just gotta go over the whole song and then do the adjustments. Now, right now I'm just applying a filter on the master, seeing if there's anything wrong with it, if there's any adjustments I should do. So far everything looks pretty good. I'm just going to adjust the snare a bit. Now what I like to do after I EQ the sample, I like to throw in a maximizer. Now what I do with the maximizer is I actually look for any peaks that stand out within the track and then I compress it. That way we can get a nice consistent sound throughout the whole song. So for the bass line, I'm just going to squeeze the top a bit, make sure it doesn't peak out too much. Then I'm going to make sure the song's a bit more mono because it's the bass line. But for now, I'm gonna leave that alone because the vocals haven't come in yet. So I'm just gonna play around with the BPM. I kind of want a more faster paced song at this point. So once I start hearing the vocals, then I can see that the volume, the loudness of the sample is starting to get a bit all over the place depending on what part of the sample. So what I did was I added a maximizer on the master track, and so far I'm not going to do anything. I'm just looking at this to sort of gauge what needs to be adjusted throughout the whole track. So for example, the bass here is not as loud, it's extremely quiet in comparison to the kick itself, so that I'm going to have to do adjustments. But now let's introduce the hi-hat. I'm going to be using the volume envelope as well as the built-in filter in Fruity Sampler to do some adjustments for the hi-hat. So I'm just going to be playing the drums, and then I'm going to use parametric EQ to adjust the hi-hat a little bit. So I'm just going to raise the highs a bit, cut off the lower ends so it doesn't clash with the kick or most of the snare. Now, while there might be any sound going through the lower frequencies, it's an important precaution to just have a filter anyway, because sometimes a small change can make a huge difference. So now I'm going to introduce a new hi-hat and then hopefully layer both of them. For the new hi-hat, I'm going to be doing the same processing as I did with the old hi-hat. So just adjusting the volume envelope, also have a high pass filter, just the same thing. And then once I hear both of them together, then I'm just going to do changes little by little to see if they sound good together. Well, in the end, I didn't like stacking them, but there was still some use for some of the hi-hats. So from there, I can move on with mixing the hi-hats a bit. In fact, I introduced a Fruity limiter just to see how both of the hi-hats look together. And they look pretty good. Doesn't seem I have to do much. But maybe I was kind of overdoing it with the high frequencies. So I just put it back to normal, make it a bit more subtle. After every step, I like to go back to the maximizer on the master channel so I can sort of isolate several frequencies and pinpoint, possible locations of error, and then I just do the adjustments from there. So here I noticed that I kind of left out the snare in the entire track. Like I only had it for the first 2 bars. So I just implement it with the rest of the song. And then I'm going to EQ the snare a bit, lower it a bit down on the higher ends. I don't want it to stand out as much. So the last thing that I did was a bit more of a personal choice. I separated all the drums and put them in their own playlist. On top of that, I also separated the hi-hats. That way the The second hi-hat only comes in during certain parts of the song. And I prefer to do it like this. That way the drums will have a bit of variation throughout the whole song. And putting all the variations in the playlist gives me a bit more control when it comes to micromanaging. But after implementing the drums, and of course doing a little bit of adjustments to the sample, I think it's fair to say we are done with this portion, and we are ready to move on to the next part, which is just to add more effects to the sample, add more adjustments to the sample, and then just starting to come together with the final mix and master. If you found this video entertaining or informative, please hit a like and subscribe. I will definitely come back to finish the next part. Until then, take it easy.